Sarah Martinez had always trusted her teammates. After 3 years of working together in the private military contracting world, she believed they were family. The scorching Arizona desert stretched endlessly in every direction as their convoy of 3 armored vehicles moved through the barren landscape. The mission was supposed to be routine: escort a high-value client to a secure facility near the Mexican border. Nothing they hadn't done dozens of times before. The radio crackled with static as team leader Marcus Kane's voice cut through the white noise. Checkpoint Alpha in sight. Everyone stay sharp. Sarah adjusted her tactical vest and checked her sidearm for the 100th time that morning. Something felt different today, though she couldn't pinpoint exactly what. The usual banter between the team members was absent, replaced by an uncomfortable silence that made her skin crawl. In the lead vehicle, Kane exchanged meaningful glances with his second-in-command, Derek Walsh. They had been planning this for months, waiting for the perfect opportunity. Sarah Martinez was becoming a problem. She had started asking too many questions about their side operations, the unexplained cash payments, and the mysterious cargo they sometimes transported without proper documentation. Her military background made her observant, perhaps too observant for their liking. The convoy slowed to a stop at what appeared to be a routine checkpoint. Sarah peered through the bulletproof glass at the makeshift barrier ahead. 2 men in desert camouflage stood beside a military-style vehicle, their faces obscured by tactical sunglasses and face wraps. Something about the scene triggered her instincts. The positioning was wrong. The angles were all off. This wasn't a legitimate checkpoint. "Kane, something's not right here," Sarah spoke in her headset. "The setup looks off. We should call this in." "Relax, Martinez." Kane's voice came back, but there was an edge to it she had never heard before. "Everything's under control. Just follow my lead." The client in her vehicle, a nervous-looking businessman named Harrison Webb, shifted uncomfortably in his seat. "Is there a problem, Miss Martinez?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Just a routine stop, sir." "Nothing to worry about," Sarah replied, though her hand instinctively moved closer to her weapon. Her military training had taught her to trust her gut, and right now, every fiber of her being was screaming that danger was approaching. Kane stepped out of the lead vehicle and approached the checkpoint guards. From her position, Sarah could see him talking animatedly with them, but couldn't make out the words. The conversation lasted several minutes, punctuated by gestures toward her vehicle. A cold realization began to settle in her stomach like a stone. "Walsh to all units." Derek's voice came through the radio. "We have a situation. Martinez, step out of your vehicle." "Now." "What kind of situation?" Sarah demanded, her training kicking in. "Walsh, what's going on?" "Just get out of the vehicle." "Sarah." Kane's voice joined the conversation. "We need to talk." Sarah's mind raced through the possibilities. The way they were positioned, the fact that they had stopped at an unauthorized checkpoint, the strange behavior of her teammates. It all pointed to one terrifying conclusion. She had been sold out. "Mr. Webb," she said quietly to her client, "when I tell you, I need you to get down on the floor and stay there. Do not look up. Do not make a sound. Do you understand me?" The businessman's eyes widened with fear, but he nodded. Sarah could see sweat beading on his forehead, despite the air conditioning in the vehicle. "Martinez, this is your last warning." Kane's voice had turned cold and threatening. "Get out now, or we come in after you." Sarah looked around quickly, assessing her options. The desert stretched for miles in every direction. The nearest town was at least 50 miles away. Her vehicle had fuel, but not enough to outrun 3 other vehicles in a sustained chase. She was outnumbered, outgunned, and trapped in the middle of nowhere. "Down now," she whispered to Webb, who immediately dropped to the floor behind the seats. Sarah opened the vehicle door slowly, her hands visible but ready to move quickly if needed. As she stepped into the blazing desert heat, she could see the predatory expressions on her former teammates' faces. They weren't even trying to hide their intentions anymore. "You know, Sarah," Kane said as he walked toward her, his weapon now openly displayed, "you always were too smart for your own good. Asking too many questions, digging where you shouldn't dig." "What is this about, Marcus?" Sarah tried to keep her voice steady, though her heart was pounding. "We're supposed to be a team. This is about business," Derek added, flanking her from the other side. "And you become bad for business." The 2 checkpoint guards moved closer, and Sarah realized they weren't random desert bandits. They were part of the setup. Her own team had orchestrated this entire scenario to get rid of her. The betrayal cut deeper than any physical wound could. "You're making a mistake," Sarah said, backing slowly toward a cluster of rocks about 30 yards away. Whatever you think I know, whatever you're afraid I might say, we can work this out. Kane laughed, but there was no humor in it. I don't think so, Martinez. You see, we've got a good thing going here. Lucrative side contracts, private arrangements with certain interested parties. We can't have a conscience interfering with that. So what's the plan? Sarah asked, still moving slowly backward. You're just trying to kill me out here? Nothing so crude, Derek replied with a cruel smile. We're going to leave you here, in the middle of the desert, with no water, no food, no transportation. Let the desert do the work for us. Cleaner that way. Sarah felt the blood drain from her face. Death by exposure in the desert was one of the most horrific ways to die. The temperature during the day could reach 120 degrees.
Please,
and
help
at
me.
night, it could drop to near freezing. Without water, a person could survive maybe 3 days, maybe 4 if they were lucky. You can't be serious, she whispered. Dead serious, Kane replied. Consider it a lesson in loyalty. Maybe if you hadn't been so curious about our business arrangements, things could have been different. The 4 men began advancing on her position. Sarah's military training kicked in automatically. She analyzed the terrain, calculated distances, assessed the tactical situation. The rocks behind her offered some cover, but not much. She was wearing her tactical vest, which would provide some protection, but she was still severely outgunned. Run, Martinez, Kane called out mockingly. Give us a little sport before we take your gear and leave you for the vultures. Sarah didn't need to be told twice. She turned and sprinted toward the rock formation, her combat boots finding purchase on the hard-packed desert floor. Behind her, she could hear shouts and the sound of running footsteps. They weren't shooting yet, which confirmed her suspicion that they wanted this to look like an accident or disappearance rather than a murder. The rocks provided temporary shelter, but she knew it was only a matter of time before they surrounded her position. Sarah's mind raced through her options. She could try to make it to one of the vehicles, but they would cut her off before she got close. She could try to negotiate, but Kane had already made it clear that wasn't an option. Or she could fight. Sarah, Kane's voice echoed off the rocks. There's nowhere to run out here. Make this easy on yourself. From her position behind a large boulder, Sarah could see the endless expanse of desert stretching in every direction. Kane was right about one thing. There was nowhere to run. The nearest civilization was dozens of miles away, and the chances of survival in the desert without proper equipment were virtually zero. But Sarah Martinez hadn't survived 3 tours in Afghanistan by giving up easily. Her military instructors had drilled into her that there was always a way, always a solution, if you were willing to fight for it. She just had to find it. The sound of footsteps crunching on gravel told her they were getting closer. Sarah checked her sidearm, fully loaded with 1 spare magazine. 46 rounds total. Against 4 armed men in open desert terrain, it wasn't much, but it was something. Time's up, Martinez. Derek's voice came from her left. They were trying to triangulate her position. Sarah closed her eyes for a moment and thought about her daughter Sophia, safe back home in San Diego. The little girl was only 8 years old, and Sarah was the only parent she had left after her father died in a car accident 2 years earlier. Sophia was counting on her mother to come home, to keep their small family together. That thought ignited a fire in Sarah's chest. She wasn't going down without a fight. If these men wanted to leave her in the desert to die, they were going to have to earn it. The betrayal still stung, but Sarah pushed the emotional pain aside and focused on survival. She had been in worse situations before, though admittedly not many. The key was to stay calm, think tactically, and look for any advantage she could find. A shadow passed overhead, and Sarah looked up to see a vulture circling lazily in the thermal currents. The sight sent a chill down her spine. Even the desert scavengers seemed to sense that death was coming to this desolate place. Last chance, Sarah, Kane shouted. Come out now, and we'll make it quick. Sarah gripped her weapon tighter and prepared herself for the fight of her life. She thought about Sophia's smile, about the bedtime stories she still had to read, about the little girl who was waiting for her mother to come home from another routine mission. They had made one crucial mistake in their planning. They assumed that Sarah Martinez would go quietly into that dark desert night. They were about to learn just how wrong they were. The first shot rang out like thunder in the desert silence. The bullet sparked off the rock inches from Sarah's head, sending chips of stone flying. She rolled to her left, finding cover behind a larger boulder as more shots followed. The sound echoed across the barren landscape, a deadly percussion that would attract every scavenger for miles. "Damn it, Kane." Derek's voice carried across the rocks. "I thought you said no shooting." "Plans change," Kane yelled back. "She's not going to make this easy." Sarah pressed her back against the sun-heated stone and tried to control her breathing. The tactical situation was becoming clearer by the minute. They had positioned themselves in a rough semicircle around the rock formation, trying to prevent her escape back toward the vehicles. But their positioning also meant they had to be careful about crossfire, which gave her a small advantage. The client, Harrison Webb, was still in her vehicle about 100 yards away. She could see him through the bulletproof glass, crouched on the floor just as she had instructed. At least he was following orders and staying out of the line of fire. Sarah hoped he would have the sense to stay hidden no matter what happened to her. A movement to her right caught her attention. One of the checkpoint guards was attempting to flank her position, moving from boulder to boulder with military precision. Sarah waited until he was exposed between two rocks, then fired twice. The first shot missed, but the second caught him in the shoulder, spinning him around and sending him crashing to the ground behind a cluster of smaller rocks. "Martinez got Tony," the second guard shouted. "She's armed and shooting back." "No kidding, genius." Derek's sarcastic reply came from somewhere to her left. "Kane, we need to finish this before someone hears the gunfire." Sarah knew Derek was right. Even in the middle of nowhere, sustained gunfire would eventually attract attention. Border Patrol, local law enforcement, or even other travelers might investigate. But that also meant her former teammates would be getting more desperate and more reckless as time passed. The desert heat was already becoming a factor. Sarah could feel sweat soaking through her tactical vest, and she had been in a firefight for less than 10 minutes. The temperature was climbing toward its daily peak, and prolonged exposure to direct sunlight would quickly become debilitating. She needed to find a way to end this confrontation quickly. "Sarah," Kane's voice had taken on a false tone of reasonableness. "This doesn't have to get any messy, eh? Come out now. And I promise we'll make it quick and painless." "Go to hell, Marcus," Sarah shouted back. "You want me, come and get me." She immediately changed positions after speaking, knowing that her voice would give away her location. Sure enough, 3 rapid shots hit the spot where she had been hiding just seconds before. Sarah had learned that lesson the hard way during urban combat training in Afghanistan. The wounded guard was moaning somewhere among the rocks, his pained breathing audible in the relative quiet between gunshots. Sarah felt a momentary pang of sympathy. He was probably just a hired gun following orders, not necessarily evil like Kane and Derek. But she couldn't afford to let compassion compromise her tactical position. He had chosen his side when he accepted money to help murder her. A new sound reached Sarah's ears, the distant rumble of a helicopter. Her heart leaped with hope for a moment before she realized the truth. The helicopter was flying away from their position, not toward it. Just a routine flight that happened to be passing through the area. Still, it reminded her that the world continued to exist beyond this deadly game of cat and mouse in the desert rocks. "Movement on the left," Derek called out. "She's trying to circle around." Sarah wasn't actually moving, but the false alarm caused 2 of her attackers to shift position, giving her a brief glimpse of Derek Walsh as he moved between cover points. She didn't have a clear shot, but she sent 2 rounds his way to keep him pinned down. The bullets sparked off rocks near his position, forcing him to duck back behind cover. "This is taking too long." Kane's voice was getting more frustrated and desperate. "Tony's bleeding all over the place, and we need to clean this up." Sarah checked her ammunition. She had fired 6 rounds, leaving her with 17 in the current magazine and 29 in her spare. Against 4 armed men, it wasn't much of a buffer. She needed to make every shot count and look for any opportunity to capture additional weapons or ammunition. The wounded guard's moaning was getting weaker, which meant he was either losing consciousness or bleeding out. Either way, it reduced the immediate threat by 25%. But Sarah knew that desperation would make the remaining 3 more dangerous, not less. A shadow passed over the rocks, and Sarah looked up to see more vultures joining the first one. The scavengers seemed to sense that death was imminent in this place. The sight filled her with cold determination. She had no intention of providing these carrion birds with a meal today. "Derek, can you get a clean angle from the north side?" Kane's voice carried clearly in the thin desert air. "Negative. She's got good cover over here." "What about you?" "Same problem." We need to flush her out somehow. Sarah smiled grimly. Their tactical discussions were giving away more information than they realized. Kane was positioned somewhere to the south, Derek to the northeast, and the second guard to the west. The wounded man was out of action to the east. If she could eliminate one more opponent, she might be able to break out of their encirclement. The sound of metal scraping against rock told her someone was moving again. Sarah peered carefully around the edge of her boulder and spotted the second checkpoint guard attempting to work his way closer to her position. He was moving with reasonable skill, using available cover and staying low, but he made one crucial mistake. He moved in a predictable pattern, always going to the nearest available cover. Sarah tracked his movement and picked the spot where he would have to expose himself to reach the next concealment point. When he made his move, she was ready. 2 quick shots caught him center mass, and he dropped immediately, his weapon clattering across the rocks as he fell. Martinez got Jimmy too. Derek's voice had lost its earlier confidence. This chick's a better shot than we thought. She's military trained, you idiot. Kane snapped back. I told you this wouldn't be a walk in the park. The tactical situation had shifted dramatically in Sarah's favor. She had eliminated 2 of her 4 attackers and was now facing even odds. More importantly, she could see Jimmy's rifle lying among the rocks about 20 yards from her position. If she could reach that weapon, she would significantly improve her firepower and ammunition situation. But getting to the rifle would require exposing herself to fire from Kane and Derek, both of whom were competent marksmen with good position and clear sight lines across much of the rock formation. Sarah studied the terrain carefully, looking for any approach that would minimize her exposure time. A hot wind swept across the desert, carrying with it the smell of creosote bush and distant dust. The sun was approaching its peak intensity, and Sarah could feel the heat radiating off the rocks around her. Her water bottle was in her tactical vest, but she resisted the urge to drink. She needed to conserve every drop for the ordeal that lay ahead, assuming she survived the current firefight. Sarah, Kane's voice took on a new tone, almost pleading. Look, maybe we can work something out here. We don't have to end this with more people getting killed. Really? Sarah called back. What kind of deal are you thinking about, Marcus? She was buying time, trying to get them talking while she planned her next move. The more they talked, the more information they might reveal about their positions and intentions. You walk away from this, Kane replied. Forget what you've seen. Forget what you think you know about our operations. We all go our separate ways, and nobody else gets hurt, including Mr. Webb in the vehicle over there, Sarah asked. There was a long pause before Kane answered. Webb was always going to be a problem. He knows too much about too many people. Sarah felt her blood run cold. They hadn't just betrayed her. They were planning to kill an innocent businessman who had trusted them to provide protection. Harrison Webb was guilty of nothing more than being in the wrong place at the wrong time with information that certain people didn't want him to share. So the plan was to kill both of us and make it look like a robbery gone wrong? Sarah asked, though she already knew the answer. Something like that, Derek's voice chimed in. Desert's a dangerous place. Lots of bad things can happen to travelers out here, especially when they're being escorted by murderous contractors, Sarah replied. She had heard enough. Whatever minimal chance there might have been for a peaceful resolution had evaporated with Kane's admission that they planned to kill Webb too. Sarah Martinez had spent her entire adult life protecting innocent people, and she wasn't about to stop now. The rifle was still lying among the rocks 20 yards away. Sarah studied the route one more time, committing every boulder and depression to memory. She would have to move fast and keep low, using the uneven terrain to mask her approach. If Kane or Derek got a clean shot during her movement, the game would be over. Sarah took a deep breath and prepared to make her move. In her mind, she could see Sophia's face again, could hear her daughter's voice asking when Mommy would be coming home. That little girl was counting on her mother to survive this nightmare and return safely to San Diego. The thought of Sophia gave Sarah the strength she needed. She burst from cover, moving low and fast across the treacherous terrain, her combat boots finding purchase on loose stones and hard-packed earth. Behind her, she could hear shouts of alarm as Kane and Derek spotted her movement. The first shots rang out just as Sarah dove for the cover of a large boulder near Jimmy's position. Bullets whined overhead and sparked off rocks all around her, but none found their mark. She rolled behind the stone formation and immediately reached for the fallen guard's rifle. The weapon was an M4 carbine, similar to what she had carried during her military service. Sarah quickly checked the magazine and chamber, fully loaded with 28 rounds remaining. She now had significantly more firepower and the psychological advantage of having successfully outmaneuvered her attackers. She's got Jimmy's rifle now. Derek shouted, "Kane, we need to move." "I can see that." Kane's reply was sharp with frustration and growing concern. Sarah smiled grimly as she settled into a comfortable shooting position behind a boulder. The tactical situation had changed again, and now she held most of the cards. Kane and Derek were the ones who needed to be worried about exposure and ammunition conservation. But Sarah knew the real fight was just beginning. Even if she managed to eliminate her remaining attackers, she would still be stranded in the middle of the desert with limited water and supplies. The temperature was continuing to climb, and she could already feel the effects of heat and stress on her body. Still, she was alive, she was armed, and she had a chance. In Sarah's experience, that was often enough to turn an impossible situation into a survivable one. She just had to keep fighting, keep thinking, and keep believing that she would make it home to Sophia. The desert vultures continued to circle overhead, but Sarah Martinez was far from ready to become their next meal. The standoff continued for another 20 minutes as the desert sun climbed higher, turning the rock formation into a furnace. Sarah could feel sweat evaporating from her skin almost as quickly as her body produced it. The dry heat was becoming a serious factor in the tactical equation. Every minute that passed drained vital fluids from her system and clouded her judgment slightly. Kane and Derek had stopped their aggressive maneuvering and settled into defensive positions, apparently reassessing their strategy. The loss of their two hired guns had clearly shaken their confidence. Sarah used the lull in action to study her remaining opponent's positions more carefully and plan her next move. Harrison Webb was still crouched in the armored vehicle, visible through the bulletproof glass whenever he dared to raise his head slightly. Sarah could see the terror in his eyes, even from 100 yards away. The businessman had probably never been in a life-threatening situation before, and the psychological shock of the betrayal and violence was clearly overwhelming him. "Sarah," Kane's voice carried across the rocks again. "You know you can't stay out here forever. The heat's going to get you long before we do." "Maybe," Sarah called back, "but I'm betting I outlast you too." Military conditioning versus desk jockey endurance. Want to find out who wins? She wasn't just taunting them. She was making a valid tactical point. Sarah had undergone extensive survival training and had operated in extreme environments during her military service. Kane and Derek had been living comfortable contractor lives for years, growing soft and complacent. The desert heat would affect them more severely and more quickly. "Besides," Sarah continued, "I'm betting you boys have people expecting you back. Wives, girlfriends, handlers who want their money delivered on time. How long can you afford to stay out here playing hide and seek?" The silence that followed suggested she had hit close to home. Criminals and corrupt contractors always had schedules to keep and people to answer to. Time was working in her favor, even if the environment wasn't. A new sound reached Sarah's ears, the distant hum of an engine. She strained to listen, trying to determine the direction and type of vehicle. After a moment, she realized it was coming from the south, back the way their convoy had traveled earlier that morning. Kane and Derek had apparently heard it too, because their radio chatter increased suddenly. Sarah couldn't make out the words, but their tone suggested concern and rapid planning. The approaching vehicle represented an unknown variable in an already complex situation. As the engine's sound grew closer, Sarah began to make out details. It was a single vehicle, probably a truck or large SUV, based on the deep rumble. Could be border patrol, local law enforcement, or just unfortunate travelers who had stumbled into the middle of a firefight. Any of those options would complicate the tactical situation dramatically. "New players in the game," Derek's voice called out. "Kane, what's the call?" "Stick to the plan," Kane replied. "If it's official, we're contractors protecting our client from bandits. If it's civilians, we deal with them appropriately." Sarah felt her blood run cold again. Kane's casual reference to dealing with civilians suggested that innocent travelers would simply become additional murder victims if they stumbled into this situation. She had to find a way to warn them, or at least minimize the potential for further bloodshed. The vehicle appeared on the horizon as a dark speck against the shimmering heat waves. It was still several miles away, but approaching at a steady speed along the rough desert track their convoy had followed earlier. Sarah estimated she had maybe 10 minutes before the new arrivals reached their position. "Listen carefully," Sarah shouted to Kane and Derek. "Whoever's coming, they don't deserve to die for your mistakes. Let me handle this. Let me wave them off before they get close enough to become targets." "Not happening, Martinez," Kane replied. "You gave up your vote in this operation when you started shooting our people. Those people were trying to murder me." Sarah shot back. "I had every right to defend myself. Self-defense, murder, it's all about perspective," Derek added with dark humor. "And from our perspective, you're a problem that needs to be solved permanently." The approaching vehicle was close enough now for Sarah to make out more details. It appeared to be a military-style Humvee, painted in desert camouflage. That could mean official military personnel, private contractors, or even cartel operatives using surplus equipment. In this part of Arizona, all three possibilities were equally likely. Sarah made a decision. She couldn't let innocent people drive into an ambush, regardless of the personal risk. Using the M4 carbine she had captured, she fired 3 spaced shots into the air, the universal signal for distress or danger. The shots echoed across the desert, clearly audible for miles in the thin air. "Damn it, Martinez." Kane's voice was furious. "Now you've guaranteed they'll investigate." "Good," Sarah replied. "Maybe they'll have enough sense to call for backup before they get close." The Humvee had stopped in response to the warning shots, still about 2 miles away. Sarah could see figures moving around the vehicle, probably using binoculars or spotting scopes to assess the situation. Professional soldiers or law enforcement officers would take time to evaluate the tactical situation before proceeding. "Kane, we need to abort." Derek's voice had lost its earlier confidence. "This is getting too complicated. Too many variables." "Negative," Kane replied firmly. "We finish what we started. Martinez dies here, Webb dies here, and whoever's in that Humvee gets the same treatment if they interfere." Sarah realized that Kane had moved beyond rational decision-making into obsessive determination. He was no longer thinking about profit or covering up his illegal operations. He was focused entirely on eliminating the threat she represented to his carefully constructed criminal enterprise. That made him more dangerous, but also more predictable. The Humvee was moving again, but more slowly and cautiously than before. The occupants were clearly aware that they were approaching a dangerous situation. Sarah hoped they would have the wisdom to stay back and radio for assistance rather than charging into the middle of an active firefight. The desert heat was becoming almost unbearable. Sarah's water bottle was nearly empty, and she could feel the early stages of heat exhaustion beginning to affect her coordination and judgment. Every movement required slightly more effort than it should, and her vision was beginning to shimmer around the edges. She needed to end this confrontation soon, before the environment became as deadly as her human opponents. A movement to her left caught Sarah's attention. Derek was attempting another flanking maneuver, using the distraction of the approaching vehicle to move closer to her position. She tracked his movement through her rifle scope, waiting for him to expose himself between cover points. When Derek made his move, Sarah was ready. She fired twice, both shots striking center mass. Derek Walsh dropped immediately, his weapon flying from his hands as he collapsed behind a cluster of rocks. He tried to call out, but only managed a weak groan before falling silent. "Derek!" Kane's voice was filled with rage and desperation. "Derek, respond." Only silence answered him. Kane was now alone, facing a trained soldier with superior position, captured weapons, and nothing left to lose. The tactical situation had shifted completely in Sarah's favor, but she knew that desperation would make Kane even more dangerous. "It's over, Marcus," Sarah called out. "Derek's down, your hired guns are dead, and you're outnumbered. Give it up." "Never." Kane's response was immediate and filled with venom. "You destroyed everything I built. My operations, my network, my future. If I'm going down, you're coming with me." Sarah heard the sound of running footsteps on gravel. Kane was moving, abandoning his defensive position for a desperate final assault. She shifted her rifle toward the sound and waited for him to appear. Kane emerged from behind a boulder about 50 yards away, firing rapidly as he charged toward her position. His shots were poorly aimed, panic and rage had destroyed his marksmanship skills. Sarah took careful aim and squeezed the trigger twice. The first shot caught Kane in the leg, spinning him around and sending him tumbling across the rocky ground. The second shot missed as he fell, sparking off stones near his head. Kane rolled behind the nearest cover, wounded but still armed and dangerous. "You can't win this, Sarah," Kane shouted, his voice strained with pain. "Even if you kill me, you're still stuck in the middle of nowhere with no water and no transportation. The desert will finish what I started." Sarah knew he was right about her survival prospects, but she wasn't about to give him the satisfaction of admitting it. She had to focus on ending the immediate threat before worrying about the longer-term challenges of desert survival. The Humvee was much closer now, close enough for Sarah to make out individual figures moving around it. She counted at least 4 people, all wearing military-style gear and moving with professional discipline. Whatever unit they represented, they were clearly trained soldiers rather than civilians or criminals. Unknown shooters in the rock formation. A voice called out through a bullhorn, "This is United States Army Special Operations. Cease fire and identify yourselves." Sarah's heart leaped with hope. Army Special Operations meant highly trained professionals who would know how to handle this situation properly. If she could communicate with them and explain what was happening, they might be able to provide assistance or at least ensure that justice was served. "This is Sarah Martinez, former Army specialist," she shouted back. "I'm being attacked by hostile contractors. One shooter remaining, wounded approximately 50 meters south of my position." "Copy that, Martinez. Stay in position and keep your weapon visible. We're moving in to secure the area." The professional competence in the soldier's voice was enormously reassuring. Sarah had been fighting this battle alone for almost 2 hours, and the prospect of backup was almost overwhelming. She forced herself to stay focused on Kane's position while the Army team moved closer. Kane apparently realized that his situation had become hopeless. Sarah could hear him moving among the rocks, probably trying to find a position that would allow him to surrender without exposing himself to return fire. The arrival of Army Special Operations had changed the entire dynamic of the confrontation. "Marcus Kane," the soldier with the bullhorn called out. "You are surrounded. Drop your weapon and show yourself with your hands visible. Go to hell." Kane's defiant reply echoed across the rocks. "I'm not going to prison." Sarah heard the distinctive sound of a grenade pin being pulled. Kane had apparently decided to go out in a blaze of destruction rather than face capture and trial. She had perhaps 3 seconds before the explosion would shower the entire area with deadly fragments. "Grenade!" Sarah shouted to warn the Army team, then dove for the deepest cover she could find among the rocks. The explosion was deafening, echoing off the stone formations and sending a cloud of dust and debris across the entire battlefield. When the dust cleared, Sarah cautiously raised her head to assess the damage. Marcus Kane was gone, along with most of the rock formation where he had been hiding. The grenade had been more powerful than Sarah expected, probably a military-grade fragmentation device rather than a standard explosive. Kane had chosen suicide over capture, taking his secrets with him into death. "Clear," one of the Army soldiers called out. "Target eliminated." Sarah slowly stood up, her hands visible and her captured rifle pointed safely downward. 4 soldiers in full combat gear were approaching her position with professional caution, their weapons ready, but not directly threatening. The nightmare firefight was finally over, but Sarah knew her ordeal was far from finished. She was still stranded in the middle of the desert with minimal supplies, and she had no idea how she was going to explain this situation to the authorities. The real survival challenge was just beginning. The lead soldier approaching Sarah was a tall, lean man with sharp eyes and the confident bearing of someone accustomed to command. His name, Tape Red Reynolds, and his insignia marked him as a master sergeant. The other 3 soldiers moved with the fluid coordination of a team that had worked together for years. "I'm Master Sergeant Reynolds, Delta Force," he said as he drew closer to Sarah's position. "Are you injured, Specialist Martinez?" "Former specialist," Sarah corrected, though she was grateful he had used her military rank rather than treating her as a civilian. "Minor cuts and scrapes, but nothing serious. There's a civilian in the armored vehicle who needs checking. Harrison Webb. He's been hiding on the floor for the past 2 hours." Reynolds nodded and gestured to one of his team members, who immediately moved toward the vehicle where Webb was still crouched. The businessman looked like he was in shock, staring through the bulletproof glass with wide, unfocused eyes. "Well, we walked into here," Reynolds said, studying the scene of destruction around them. "This wasn't a random desert bandit attack. Want to tell me what really happened?" Sarah took a deep breath and began explaining the situation from the beginning. The illegal side operations, her growing suspicions about her team's activities, the setup at the fake checkpoint, and the deliberate plan to leave her and Webb to die in the desert. Reynolds listened without interruption, occasionally making notes in a small tactical notebook. "So Kane, Walsh, and their hired muscle decided to eliminate you both to protect their criminal enterprise," Reynolds summarized when she finished. "And they chose this location specifically because it would make the deaths look accidental." "That's about the size of it," Sarah confirmed. "Although I suspect there's more to their operation than simple smuggling or weapons running. The client, Webb, apparently had information that made him dangerous to some very important people." One of Reynolds' team members approached and reported quietly. Sarah caught fragments of the conversation, civilian in shock, but uninjured, multiple deceased hostiles, evidence of professional planning. Reynolds turned back to Sarah. "My medic is checking on Mr. Webb. He's physically unharmed, but experiencing severe psychological trauma from the incident. We'll need to get him to a hospital for proper evaluation and treatment." "What about the investigation?" Sarah asked. "This whole thing involves federal crimes, murder for hire, conspiracy. There are going to be a lot of questions that need answers." "Already in progress," Reynolds replied. "We were actually tracking Kane's operation for several weeks as part of a larger investigation into contractor corruption along the border. Your firefight today just accelerated our timeline considerably." Sarah felt a wave of relief wash over her. If Delta Force had already been investigating Kane's activities, it meant there might be documentation and evidence to support her version of events. She wouldn't have to convince skeptical authorities that her former teammates had tried to murder her. The truth was already known to the right people. "Why were you out here today?" Sarah asked. "This seems like an awfully fortunate coincidence." Reynolds smiled slightly. "No coincidence. We've been monitoring Kane's radio communications for days. When we heard about today's escort mission to this particular location, we decided to follow at a discreet distance. This whole area is a known corridor for illegal activities." "So you heard the firefight developing?" "We heard Kane discussing the plan to eliminate you and Webb," Reynolds said grimly. "We were moving to intercede when the shooting started. Your warning shots confirmed that the situation had gone active, so we approached more cautiously to avoid making the tactical situation worse." Sarah felt another wave of relief. If Delta Force had intercepted Kane's communications, they had direct evidence of the planned murders. She wouldn't have to rely solely on her own testimony to prove what had happened. The medic finished his examination of Harrison Webb and helped the businessman out of the armored vehicle. Webb looked pale and shaky, but he was walking under his own power. He spotted Sarah and immediately approached her with tears in his eyes. "Miss Martinez," he said, his voice trembling with emotion, "I don't know how to thank you. You saved my life back there. If you hadn't fought them off, we'd both be dead by now." "Just doing my job, Mr. Webb," Sarah replied. "Are you going to be okay?" "Physically, yes. Emotionally, I think it's going to take some time to process what happened. I trusted those men to protect me, and they were planning to murder me the entire time." Reynolds intervened gently. "Mr. Webb, we're going to need a full statement from you about Kane's operation and any information you might have about his criminal activities. But that can wait until you've had proper medical attention and some time to recover." "Of course," Webb nodded. "I want those bastards' entire network exposed and destroyed. What they were doing, it goes far beyond simple corruption. There are people in very high places who were paying them to eliminate inconvenient witnesses and whistleblowers." Sarah exchanged glances with Reynolds. If Webb's information implicated high-level officials in a murder-for-hire conspiracy, this case was going to become a major federal investigation with national security implications. "How extensive was Kane's network?" Reynolds asked Webb. "Huge," Webb replied. "Multiple contractor companies, government officials, corporate executives, even some military officers. They have been operating for at least 3 years that I know of, probably longer. The money involved was astronomical." One of Reynolds' team members approached and spoke quietly to his commanding officer. Sarah caught enough of the conversation to understand that they were coordinating with other federal agencies and requesting additional investigative resources. "Martinez," Reynolds said, turning back to her, You're going to be a key witness in this investigation. The Department of Justice is going to want extensive debriefings, and there will probably be congressional hearings once the scope of this conspiracy becomes clear. Understand, Sarah said. I'll cooperate fully with whatever investigation is necessary. But right now, I just want to get home to my daughter. She's probably worried sick about why I haven't called. About that, Reynolds said with a slight smile. Delta Force takes care of its own, and you proved today that you still think like a soldier. We're going to make sure you and your daughter are protected during this investigation. Kane's network might have other operatives who could target you for testifying. Sarah hadn't thought about the possibility of retaliation, but Reynolds was right to be concerned. If Kane's criminal enterprise was as extensive as Webb suggested, there could be powerful people with strong motivations to silence potential witnesses. What kind of protection are we talking about? Sarah asked. Relocation assistance, new identities if necessary, financial support until the trials are concluded, Reynolds explained. The government has a vested interest in keeping key witnesses alive and willing to testify. The practical implications were staggering. Sarah's life and her daughter's life had been completely upended in the space of a few hours. Even if they survived this ordeal physically, the psychological and emotional aftermath was going to last for years. After this investigation concludes, you're going to need a new career anyway. Your contractor work is finished, and civilian employment might be difficult given your high profile as a witness. Special operations offers good pay, excellent benefits, and the chance to serve your country at the highest level. The offer was tempting, but Sarah's immediate concern was her daughter's safety and well-being. I appreciate the offer, but I have to think about Sophia. She's only 8 years old, and she's already lost her father. I can't risk leaving her an orphan. Delta Force has excellent family support programs, Reynolds said. And, frankly, your daughter might be safer with you in the military than in civilian witness protection. Our security is better, our resources are more extensive, and our people are more experienced at dealing with serious threats. One of the other team members approached with a radio. Sergeant Reynolds, we have multiple agencies requesting immediate transport for the witnesses. FBI wants them in Phoenix for debriefing, Marshal Service wants them in protective custody, and DOJ wants them in Washington for preliminary interviews. Tell them all to wait, Reynolds replied firmly. These people have been through a traumatic experience, and they need immediate medical attention and psychological support before anyone starts demanding statements and depositions. Sarah was grateful for Reynolds' protective attitude. The bureaucratic machinery of federal law enforcement was already beginning to grind into motion, and she could see how easy it would be for her and Webb to get lost in the shuffle of competing agency jurisdictions and political considerations. What happens now? Webb asked, clearly overwhelmed by the complexity of the situation. Now we get you both to safety, Reynolds said. Medical evaluation, psychological counseling, and then careful, methodical debriefings with proper legal representation. This case is going to be too important to rush or mishandle. Sarah looked around at the scene of devastation in the desert rocks. 4 men were dead, multiple federal crimes had been exposed, and a major conspiracy was about to be unraveled. But somehow, against all odds, she had survived. Sergeant Reynolds, she said, about that Delta Force offer. Can I have some time to think about it? Talk it over with my daughter? Of course, he replied. But don't take too long. The world is a dangerous place, and it's getting more dangerous every day. We need people like you. People who understand that some things are worth fighting for, worth risking everything to protect. As they prepared to leave the desert battlefield, Sarah thought about everything that had led to this moment. The betrayal, the fear, the desperate fight for survival, and now the possibility of a completely new life. It was almost too much to process. But one thing was certain, she had proven to herself and others that Sarah Martinez was a survivor, a fighter, and someone who would never give up and stake her life and death. Whatever challenges lay ahead, she would face them with courage and determination. The desert vultures continued to circle overhead, but they would have to look elsewhere for their next meal. Sarah Martinez was going home to her daughter, and she was going home alive. 6 months later, Sarah Martinez stood in the witness box at the Federal District Courthouse in Washington, D.C., wearing a crisp dress uniform with the distinctive insignia of Delta Force Special Operations. The courtroom was packed with reporters, federal prosecutors, defense attorneys, and family members of both victims and defendants. The trial of United States versus Blackwood Industries and Associates had become one of the most significant corruption cases in recent military history. Please state your current occupation for the record, the lead prosecutor requested. Master Sergeant Sarah Martinez, United States Army Special Operations Command, Delta Force, Sarah replied clearly. Her voice was steady and confident, a stark contrast to the traumatized woman who had been rescued from the Arizona desert half a year earlier. The months following the desert incident had been a whirlwind of debriefings, investigations, and revelations about the scope of Kane's criminal network. Webb's information had indeed led to a massive federal investigation that implicated dozens of contractor companies, government officials, and military officers in a conspiracy that stretched from the Mexican border to the Pentagon itself. Sarah's decision to accept Reynolds' offer to join Delta Force had proven to be the right choice for both her and Sophia. The military's family support programs had helped her daughter cope with the trauma of their experience, and the structure and purpose of military life had given Sarah a sense of direction during the difficult months of testimony and legal proceedings. Sergeant Martinez, the prosecutor continued, please describe for the jury what happened on the morning of March 15th in the Arizona desert. Sarah had told this story dozens of times to investigators, grand juries, and congressional committees, but it never got easier. The betrayal by her former teammates still stung, and the memory of fighting for her life in the desert rocks remained vivid and painful. But she had learned to channel those emotions into determination to see justice served. She began with the convoy's departure that morning, the unusual behavior of Kane and Walsh, and the fake checkpoint where the betrayal was revealed. The courtroom was silent as she described the firefight, the desperate struggle for survival, and the arrival of Delta Force personnel who had been monitoring Kane's communications. In your opinion, Sergeant Martinez, what would have happened to you and Mr. Webb if Delta Force had not intervened? We would have died in that desert, Sarah replied without hesitation. Kane and Walsh had planned our murders down to the smallest detail. They intended for our deaths to look accidental, travelers who got lost and died of exposure. If Master Sergeant Reynolds and his team hadn't been monitoring their communications, no one would ever have known what really happened to us. The defense attorney for Blackwood Industries rose to begin cross-examination. He was an expensive-looking man in a perfectly tailored suit, the kind of lawyer that major corporations hired when they were facing serious federal charges. Sergeant Martinez, isn't it true that you had been displaying erratic behavior and paranoid suspicions about your teammates for weeks before this alleged incident? No, that is not true, Sarah replied firmly. I had legitimate concerns about illegal activities that I was observing. Unexplained cash payments, undocumented cargo, meetings with unidentified individuals. Those aren't paranoid suspicions. They're the observations of a trained soldier who knows when something isn't right. Sergeant Martinez, how much money did the government pay you for your testimony in this case? The government didn't pay me anything for my testimony, Sarah replied. I'm receiving my normal military salary as a member of Delta Force, but that compensation is completely separate from my role as a witness in this trial. But you did receive substantial financial benefits from the government after the incident, didn't you? Housing, medical care, education benefits for your daughter? I received the standard support that any military family receives, Sarah said. My daughter and I also received assistance through the Federal Witness Protection Program, which was necessary because some of the people involved in this conspiracy might have targeted us for retaliation. The questioning continued for several hours, with the defense attorney trying every possible angle to discredit Sarah's testimony. But her story remained consistent, and her demeanor remained professional throughout the ordeal. When the cross-examination finally concluded, Sarah felt a sense of relief that this phase of her involvement was nearly finished. During a brief recess, Master Sergeant Reynolds approached Sarah in the corridor outside the courtroom. He had been attending the trial to provide support and to testify about Delta Force's role in uncovering the conspiracy. How are you holding up? He asked. Better than I expected, Sarah replied honestly. The hardest part isn't the testimony. It's seeing all the lives that were destroyed by Kane's operation. The families of the people they killed, the honest contractors who lost their jobs when the industry was investigated, the military personnel whose careers were ruined by association. You can't take responsibility for other people's choices, Reynolds reminded her. Kane and his associates chose to become criminals. You chose to stand up and fight back. Those are very different moral decisions. Sarah nodded, though she still struggled with survivor's guilt and the knowledge that her survival had come at the cost of other people's deaths. Therapy had helped, but some emotional wounds would take years to heal completely. Any word on how Sophia is doing at school? Reynolds asked. Sarah's daughter had been enrolled in a military academy near Fort Bragg, where she could receive excellent education while being protected by military security. She's thriving, Sarah said with a smile. Her grades are excellent, she's made new friends, and she tells everyone her mom is a superhero. The counselors say she's processed the trauma remarkably well for someone her age. Kids are more resilient than we give them credit for, Reynolds observed. And having a mother like you probably helps. She knows you'll always fight to protect her, no matter what the odds. The trial resumed, and Sarah listened as other witnesses testified about different aspects of the conspiracy. Webb provided devastating testimony about the financial scope of the operation and the high-level officials who had been involved. FBI agents presented evidence seized from Kane's offices and safe houses. Military investigators described the weapons and equipment that had been illegally diverted from official channels. By the time all the evidence had been presented, the scope of the criminal enterprise was staggering. Kane's network had been responsible for at least 17 murders, hundreds of illegal weapons transfers, and the corruption of dozens of government and military officials. The financial damages exceeded $50 million, not counting the human cost and lives destroyed and careers ruined. The jury deliberated for 3 days before returning guilty verdicts on all major charges. The sentences handed down were severe: life imprisonment for the surviving conspirators, massive financial penalties for the corporations involved, and forfeiture of all assets connected to the criminal enterprise. After the verdicts were announced, Sarah stood outside the courthouse with Webb and Reynolds, facing a crowd of reporters and photographers. The case had attracted national attention, and Sarah had become something of a folk hero, the brave soldier who had stood up to corruption and survived against impossible odds. Sergeant Martinez, one reporter called out, "What's next for you now that this trial is concluded?" "I'm returning to active duty with Delta Force," Sarah replied. "This experience has reminded me why I chose to serve my country in the first place. There are people out there who need protection from those who would exploit or harm them. That's what soldiers do. We stand between the innocent and the darkness. Do you have any message for other whistleblowers who might be afraid to come forward about corruption?" Sarah thought carefully before answering. "I would tell them that doing the right thing is never easy, and it's never safe. But it's always worth it. The people who died in this conspiracy deserve justice, and the people who might become victims in the future deserve protection. Sometimes one person has to be willing to stand up and fight, even when the odds seem impossible." After the press conference, Sarah, Reynolds, and Webb went to a quiet restaurant to decompress and reflect on the long journey from that terrible morning in the Arizona desert to this moment of justice and closure. "What will you do now?" Sarah asked Webb. The businessman had been through his own ordeal of testimony and threats, and his life had been completely disrupted by his role in exposing the conspiracy. "I'm starting a new company," Webb replied. "Security consulting, but with a focus on ethical practices and transparency. There's a lot of demand for honest contractors who can be trusted to do the right thing, even when no one is watching." "That sounds like exactly what the industry needs," Sarah said. "I want you to know," Webb continued, "that what you did that day in the desert saved more than just our lives. By fighting back, by refusing to give up, you exposed a conspiracy that was destroying people's lives and corrupting everything it touched. You're a genuine hero, Sarah." Sarah felt uncomfortable with the hero label, but she understood what Webb meant. Sometimes heroism wasn't about grand gestures or dramatic battles. It was about refusing to give up when everything seemed hopeless, about doing what was right even when it was dangerous and difficult. 3 weeks later, Sarah was back at Fort Bragg, participating in advanced training exercises with her Delta Force unit. The physical challenges were intense, but she welcomed the opportunity to push herself to new limits and prove that she belonged among the military's elite soldiers. During a break in the training, Sarah received a letter from Sophia. Her daughter's handwriting was still somewhat childish, but the message was clear and heartfelt. "Dear Mom, I'm proud of you for being so brave and helping catch the bad guys. My teacher says you're a hero, and that you showed everyone that one person can make a difference if they don't give up. I love you, and I can't wait to see you when you come home. Love, Sophia. Sarah wiped away tears as she finished reading the letter. Everything she had endured, the betrayal, the terror, the months of investigation and testimony, had been worth it to ensure that her daughter could grow up in a world where justice prevailed over corruption and courage triumphed over evil. As the sun set over the training facility, Sarah looked toward the horizon and thought about the future. There would be more missions, more challenges, and probably more moments when she would have to choose between safety and doing what was right. But she was ready for whatever came next. The little girl who was waiting for her mother to come home deserved to inherit a world where good people were willing to fight for what was right, no matter how high the cost or how dangerous the battle. Sarah Martinez had learned in the Arizona desert that she was exactly that kind of person, and she intended to spend the rest of her life proving it. The desert had tried to claim her, but instead it had forged her into something stronger than she had ever imagined possible. Now she was ready to use that strength to protect others and serve a cause greater than herself. The fight for justice never ended, but Sarah Martinez was prepared to fight it for as long as necessary. In the distance, a helicopter approached the landing pad, bringing new recruits who would begin their own journey toward becoming elite soldiers. Sarah smiled as she watched them disembark, remembering her own nervousness when she had first arrived at this place. They had no idea what challenges lay ahead, but she was confident they would find the strength to overcome them, just as she had found the strength to survive her ordeal in the desert. The cycle continued, and the mission endured. Sarah Martinez was home.